Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, let get lost in the story, relax, and drift off to sleep. Please subscribe to my channel and let me know which country you're watching from. Polygamous 3 Throughout History, a documentary narration script for our 4-hour cinematic storytelling. Chapter 1. In the beginning, marriage and polygamy. In early human societies, human history has been shaped around a universal institution, marriage. Yet what marriage is, how it is defined, and how many people it encompasses has varied enormously across centuries and civilizations. Today, in many societies, monogamy, the union of one woman and one man, is regarded as the natural and sole form of marriage. Yet looking at a great portion of human history, and indeed at many cultures across the globe, one finds a reality far more complex and multi-layered. Polygamy, the practice of one person having multiple spouses simultaneously, is a social practice documented from the earliest days of written records. Yet polygamy is not a single phenomenon. Researchers divide the concept into two main forms: polygyny, where a married to more than one woman at the same time, and polyandry, where a woman is married to more than one man at the same time. Polygyny has been the most common form historically. Polyandry is comparatively rare, yet has existed as a highly functional practice in certain communities. To understand how marriage took shape among early human societies, we must turn to archaeological and anthropological evidence. The traces left by Paleolithic humans reveal small hunter-gatherer communities. While it is impossible to know with certainty how gender relations were organized in these groups, ethnographic studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer communities provide important clues. In these communities, marriage was shaped largely by economic and survival concerns. For a man to marry more than one woman was a choice that affected both his status and the resource sharing of the group. When the first settled agricultural communities were established in the fertile soils of Mesopotamia, the concept of property began to emerge. Property, inheritance, and lineage became powerful forces transforming the structure of marriage. Now it mattered not only who a man was, but what he owned. Questions such as to whom his property would pass, which child would be considered legitimate, and which woman would be the primary wife came to define the social order. The Sumerian civilization left some of the earliest known written records relating to polygamy. Clay tablets prepared approximately 4,500 years ago contain explicit statements indicating that men were married to more than one woman. Yet these documents also reveal a clear hierarchy between the primary wife and secondary wives. The primary wife, referred to in Assyrian as As-Satu, held a privileged position both legally and socially. Secondary wives or concubines had far more limited rights. However, the Debor could be recognized as legitimate with the father's approval. The Babylonian civilization that followed the Sumerians placed these practices within a written legal framework. The Code of Hammurabi one of the oldest comprehensive legal texts known to history, contains detailed regulations concerning the institution of marriage. These laws explicitly permitted a man to take a second wife without divorcing an ailing first wife, or to keep the first wife at home and take a concubine elsewhere. At the same time, provisions protecting the rights of the first wife were also present, demonstrating that polygamy, while socially accepted, subject to certain rules. When we turn to ancient Egypt, a different yet equally complex picture emerges. Polygamy existed in Egypt, though monogamy is estimated to have been more common among ordinary people. For pharaohs and nobles, the situation was very different. Ramesses, known as Ramesses the Great, is known to have had more than 4 official wives and numerous concubines. Yet a feature distinguishing Egypt from other ancient civilizations was that women possessed comparatively stronger legal rights. An Egyptian woman could own property, testify in court, and initiate divorce. In ancient Chinese civilization, polygamy took on an institutional dimension. The distinction in Chinese tradition between Jiangxi, the principal wife, and Kai, secondary wives or concubines, was clear-cut and legally defined. In this system, the principal wife was generally chosen through mutual family agreement, while secondary wives joined the household through various means. The children of the principal wife were prioritized in terms of inheritance. Confucian teaching reinforced the household hierarchy, presenting it as a moral necessity. Looking at ancient India, the Vedic texts explicitly acknowledge polygamy. The great epics such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana are filled with male characters who have multiple wives. But the notable point is this. In the Mahabharata, the character Draupadi is married to the 5 Pandava brothers. This is an important document demonstrating the existence of polyandry, a woman simultaneously married to more than one husband in ancient India. Looking at these early periods overall, it is clearly apparent that marriage was never merely the emotional bond of 2 individuals. Marriage is a complex institution in which economics, politics, religion, lineage, and social status are intertwined. Polygamy is a reflection of this complexity, a practice that is neither fully universal nor fully exceptional, carrying different meanings depending on its era and geography. Chapter 2, Ancient Greece and Rome, Legal Monogamy. Practical pluralism. Ancient Greece and Rome are regarded as the cornerstones of Western civilization. These civilizations have left deep imprints on contemporary law, philosophy, and family life. Yet what is interesting is this. While both civilizations adopted a legally monogamous understanding of marriage, in practice sexuality and family structure were approached within a far wider and more pluralistic framework. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, a man could enter legal marriage with only one woman. This marriage was conducted through a ceremony called Polygamous, encompassing family and relatives. The fundamental purpose of marriage was explicitly stated: to bear legitimate children and ensure the continuity of the family. Marriage was an economic and political arrangement rather than emotional one. Large age differences between the parties were entirely normal. For Athenian men, however, monogamy was merely a legal requirement, not a moral constraint. Athenian society recognized 3 different categories of women, each serving different functions. The wife, known as Gonike, managed the home and bore legitimate children. The Palike, a mistress or live-in companion, accompanied the man without a legal bond. The hetera was an educated, intelligent companion well-versed in music and philosophy. These categories were socially accepted, and it was both common and approved for men to maintain relationships with multiple women in this arrangement simultaneously. Philosophers did not question this order. They sometimes justified it. Aristotle, arguing that women were by nature subordinate to men, implied that the marriage order should reflect this hierarchy. Plato in the Republic put forward an unconventional but thought-provoking proposal: the communal sharing of wives and children. While this utopian idea resembles a form of polygamy, Plato's aim was not individual polygamy, but rather a form of social collectivism. The Roman Empire also maintained a legally monogamous structure. In Roman law, matrimonium justum, lawful marriage, was a bond between a citizen and another person of appropriate status, producing specific legal consequences. Polygamous marriage was unlawful and bigamy was considered a crime. Yet for Roman men too, monogamy was merely a formal framework. In Roman society, freed women, slaves, and mistress relationships were recognized as channels in which extramarital sexual relations openly existed. Concubinatus, the keeping of concubines, was both common and acceptable for men of high status. A man could live with a woman he kept as a concubine in a quasi-formal status. Children born of such relationships could, under certain conditions, obtain inheritance rights. When we look at the Roman emperors, an even more striking picture emerges. However restrictive the legal framework, the sexual and marital practices of the emperors spanned an extraordinarily wide range. Julius Caesar was renowned for maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously. Augustus enacted morality laws, yet did not regulate his own private life according to them. Caligula and Nero approached the institution of marriage in entirely unconventional ways. A notable example is the story of Emperor Nero. Nero castrated a slave named Sporus, dressed him as a woman, and held an official wedding ceremony for him. He also married another slave named Pythagoras, this time taking on the role of bride himself. These stories may appear as anecdotes consigned to the margins of history, but they actually demonstrate how flexibly the institution of marriage could be interpreted even at the very apex of society. Together with the Greek tradition absorbed by Roman culture, various marriage practices continued to exist across the vast geography of the empire. In Egypt, under Roman rule, the practice of sibling marriage was present, and had spread from the Ptolemaic dynasty down to ordinary people. In Palestine and among Jewish communities, polygamy was both legally and socially ordinary. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, this picture began gradually to change. Christian clergy and thinkers began to argue that marriage was sacred and indissoluble, and that monogamy aligned with God's will. Yet this transformation was not sudden. It took centuries and did not penetrate all levels of society simultaneously. The legacy of ancient Greece and Rome left an ambivalent effect on the Western understanding of marriage. On one side, the institutional framework establishing legal monogamy. Other, the social practice normalizing extramarital relationships. This duality would clash with the Christian moral understanding in subsequent periods and would constitute one of the fundamental tensions in the history of Western sexuality and marriage. Chapter 3: Sacred Texts and Plural Marriage. From the Torah to the New Testament, the role of religions in shaping understandings of marriage is undeniable. This influence is far more complex than we might imagine, and has undergone major transformations over time. Looking at the sacred texts of the Jewish tradition, the Torah and the body of law shaped around it, polygamy appears not merely tolerated, but at times openly endorsed. Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon, these four figures, the fundamental reference points of the Abrahamic faiths, also rank among history's most famous polygamous men. Abraham's simultaneous relationship, his wife Sarah and his concubine Hagar, is explicitly narrated in the book of Genesis. Jacob married Leah and Rachel, and additionally took the concubines of both women as companions, establishing a polygamous household with a total of 12 sons. The number of Prophet David's wives is reported to have ranged between 8 and 12, with numerous concubines as well. His son Solomon possesses a figure that stands out even in the shadow of all these examples. The 11th chapter of the first book of Kings states that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Whether these numbers actually reached such dimensions is debated among historians, but the text itself presents polygamy as an expression of achievement. A more interesting dimension of the Torah is the legal framework regulating polygamy. The books of Exodus and Deuteronomy contain provisions regarding obligations toward wives in cases where a man has more than one. A man could not neglect his first wife. He was obliged to provide her with food, clothing, and marital rights. These provisions, far from prohibiting polygamy, accept it as a legal reality and place it under protection. Since there was no explicit prohibition against polygamy in the Torah, early communities continued the practice. Yet debate began to grow over time. Disagreements over polygamy are documented in rabbinic texts, such as the Mishnah and the Talmud. Some scholars sought to discourage multiple marriages, arguing that fulfilling the obligation to treat wives fairly was in practice extremely difficult. The turning point came approximately 1,000 years ago. Jerusalem ben Judah of Mainz has gone down in history by his epithet meaning light of the exile. At the end of the 10th century, he issued an edict for Ashkenazi Jewish communities that made monogamy obligatory under religious law. Although Gersham's edict was initially regarded as a temporary measure for a certain period, it eventually became a permanent norm for Ashkenazi Jews. Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jewish communities remained outside this edict's scope, and polygamy continued in these communities for much longer. Indeed, polygamy among Yemenite Jews persisted until the establishment of the State of Israel and its legal prohibition in 1950. Turning to the Christian tradition, the picture begins to differentiate. The New Testament contains no verse directly prohibiting polygamy. However, the New Testament approaches the subject of marriage from a different perspective. When Jesus is asked about divorce in the Gospel of Matthew, he says that God created from the beginning one man and one woman, and that the two shall become one flesh. These words have been interpreted not as a universal command making monogamy obligatory, but rather as a specific answer to a particular question. The letters of Paul contain more practical advice for early Christian communities. In the first letter to Timothy, it is stated that those wishing to become church leaders should be the husband of one wife. This phrase has been interpreted differently over the centuries. Some theologians have read it as a rule prohibiting polygamy for those in leadership positions. Others have argued that this phrase determines a standard only for church leadership, not the marriage norm for ordinary believers. Thus, in the early Christian period, there were debates on polygamy, but there was no definitive and universal prohibition. The clarification of this prohibition and the establishment of monogamy as the norm in Western Christian tradition came about partly through the institutional power of the Roman Church and partly through the slow maturation of Christian theology. Church fathers such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas that marriage three fundamental purposes: procreation, fidelity, and the quality of being a sacred mystery. Within this framework, monogamy became the symbol of the singular and indivisible union between God and the Church. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, church courts held the authority to adjudicate matrimonial disputes. Polygamy was regarded as a religious crime and punished with severe sanctions. Yet even in this period, mistress relationships, serial marriages, and non-ecclesiastical unions continue to exist in practice. This deep divide between legal rule and social reality constitutes an inseparable part of Western history. Chapter 4: Islam and Plural Marriage. Restriction or permission. Islam's approach to polygamy has been the subject of intense debate throughout history, both among Muslims and among those evaluating Islam from the outside. When the Quranic verses on this matter are detached from the context in which they were revealed and applied under different social conditions over the centuries, they have given rise to mutually contradictory interpretations. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Arabian Peninsula was in the midst of deep social transformation. In the pre-Islamic period, known as the Age of Ignorance, Jahiliyyah, there were no legal restrictions on marriage for Arab men. A man could marry as many women as he wished. Legal guarantees for widows and orphans were extremely weak or non-existent. Women in many situations could be passed down as property through inheritance. In Surah An-Nisa, the Quran, the 3rd verse of the 4th chapter, the following passage appears: "If you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or what your right hands possess." This verse can be evaluated both as a permission and a restriction. The permission explicitly recognizes marriage of up to 4 wives. The restriction is the condition of justice. Theologians have interpreted this condition of justice in 2 ways. The first interpretation is built on material justice. Equal financial resources, equal dwelling, and equal time must be devoted to each wife. According to this interpretation, a man with the economic means to fulfill these conditions may contract a polygamous marriage. The second interpretation focuses on emotional justice, and the Quran itself is invoked to support this interpretation. Verse 129 of Surah Nisa states, "You will never be able to be equal between wives, even if you should strive to do so." When these 2 verses are read together, the interpretation comes to the fore that the Quran, without prohibiting polygamy, has effectively made it subject to an impossible condition. The Prophet Muhammad's own marital history adds a further dimension to this debate. The Prophet married Khadija, a wealthy widow and businesswoman, when he was approximately 25 years old. This marriage lasted until Khadija's death, during which time the Prophet did not marry another woman. After Khadija's death, particularly during the Medina period, it is known that the Prophet married more than one woman. The great majority of these marriages were grounded in practical considerations such as forging political alliances or providing social security for widowed women. In classical Islamic law, the fiqh literature, polygamy was considered permissible by all 4 legal schools, though each school attached various conditions and restrictions to this permission. The Hanafi school prioritized financial capacity, while the Maliki school emphasized the condition that no harm be done to the first wife. Women were also able, under classical Islamic law, to insert a clause into the marriage contract prohibiting their husband from taking another wife. Looking at historical practice, polygamy did not become equally prevalent in every era or across every social stratum. At colorful courts and among the upper classes, polygamy and the acquisition of concubines were extremely common. In Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the great caliphal palaces are known to have maintained large harems among farming families and the lower classes of towns. However, polygamy was far less common, since the economic burden of an additional wife was extremely heavy. The Ottoman Empire presents a particularly interesting picture. Ottoman law recognized and regulated the Islamic permission for up to 4 wives. The Sultan's harems, however, technically consisted not of wives, but of concubines with a special legal status, a complex set of legal categories separately regulated. What is notable is that despite this institutional structure, the vast majority of the Ottoman population was monogamous. Estimates from various periods indicate that between 90 and 95% of urban Ottoman households were monogamous. In the modern era, polygamy in the Muslim world has become a contested terrain. Some Muslim-majority countries have prohibited polygamy or placed it under judicial supervision. Tunisia became the first Muslim-majority country to enact a law requiring monogamy in 1956. Turkey, having established a secular legal order independent of religious law in 1926, prohibited polygamy. In Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and many other countries, polygamy remains legal, though it is a minority practice in application. The issue of Islam and polygamy remains today a focal point of religious, political, and social tension. Feminist Muslim theologians argue that the Quran already contains the necessary tools to prohibit polygamy, and that if these tools were consistently interpreted, monogamy would become the norm. Traditional scholars maintain that this permission was granted by divine will and served an important function in the context of its time. Chapter 5. The Steppes of Central Asia and the Mongol Empire. The marriages of power, the vast steppes of Central Asia, formed the stage for some of history's most dramatic and least told marriage practices. The nomadic way of life fundamentally differentiated the function and structure of marriage from that of settled societies. Here, marriage was above all a component of the networks of alliance among clans, tribes, and peoples. Before being the union of individual persons, in Turkic and Mongol traditions, the number of wives possessed by a leader or warrior was the tangible indicator of his power, prestige, and network of alliances. To take the daughter of a tribe was to forge a lasting bond with that tribe. Conquerors integrated into the lands they passed through by way of marriages with local dynasties, thereby consolidating their rule. Within this framework, polygamy was not merely a personal preference, but a political tool. Genghis Khan is the founder of the empire that conquered the most territory in history, and his life is an extraordinary example of how political marriages could be converted into cumulative power. Genghis Khan had 4 principal wives, or Qadis, among whom the most important was Borti. Beyond these, he is known to have had more than 17 secondary wives and numerous concubines. Recent genetic research has revealed that the Y chromosome descended from a single ancestor who lived approximately 800 years ago is carried by between 8 and 16% of the population of Central Asia. This ancestor is strongly presumed to be Genghis Khan, though no definitive proof exists. This finding reveals how extensively the demographic impact of a single individual's reproductive activity could spread across a geography, Genghis Khan's children and grandchildren continued this polygamous political strategy. His eldest, Jochi, reportedly had more than 40 sons. Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China and maintained a large-harem administration in accordance with both Chinese and Mongol traditions. Timur, the conqueror known to the west as Tamerlane, followed a similar strategy. After each new conquest, he forged kinship ties with local dynasties, consolidating both his power and his lineage. Another notable practice relating to marriage in Central Asian tradition is levirate marriage. This custom provided that after a man's death, his brother would take the widow or widows of the deceased. This practice rested on both an economic and a demographic logic. A widowed woman would be provided security without remaining husbandless. Children would be protected, and family property would not be dispersed. In Mongol law, this tradition was given a legal framework, and the clan's marital order was built upon it. Similar patterns are seen in the Turkic state tradition. The harem arrangements of the Seljuk and later Ottoman sultans clearly reveal the political and institutional dimensions of polygamy. In the Ottoman court, the sultan's consorts were technically referred to as Hazreti and were not required to hold the status of legal wife. This system created a complex balance of power that, by keeping the sultan's maternal lineage ambiguous, facilitated the rise to prominence of the most capable member of the dynasty in state governance. The position of women in this system presents an extremely contradictory picture. On one side, the limited rights and security of a junior wife in a polygamous arrangement. The genuine influence that intelligent and powerful women could acquire in the political games within the harem. Hurrem Sultan, as the chief consort of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, profoundly influenced palace politics and broke the tradition of Ottoman sultans, not contracting official marriages. Her story highlights not only the doors this system closed to women, but also how a powerful woman could transcend these limits. This panorama, stretching from the Central Asian steppes to the furthest reaches of the Mongol Empire, once again proves that polygamy was never merely a sexual preference. In these lands, marriage was an extension of the battlefield. Where the sword could not reach, the cradle would bind. Checked. So 6. Polygamy in Africa. From tradition to the present day, the African continent is home to humanity's longest and most diverse history of civilizations. This diversity manifests itself in marriage practices as well. Across the continent's vast geography, amid differing climates, economies, religions, and political structures, the institution of marriage has taken extremely varied forms. Nevertheless, in much of sub-Saharan Africa, polygamy has historically been both prevalent and deeply rooted as an institutional practice. Looking at the historical roots of polygamy in Africa, two fundamental dynamics stand out: economic and demographic logic, and the system of social status. These two dynamics have formed a cycle that feeds and reinforces each other. From an economic standpoint, In agriculture, beer-based communities, labor was extremely valuable. Over much of sub-Saharan Africa, human labor constituted a critical constraint on agricultural production. In this context, a large family and many children were directly equivalent to an economic asset. More than one wife meant more children and more labor. At the same time, owning more than one wife in certain traditions reflected both a man's prosperity and his family's social status. From a demographic perspective, historical African communities were forced to contend with high mortality rates due to disease, war, and migration. Under these conditions, population growth was critically important for social resilience in areas of low population density. Polygamy may represent a response developed against this demographic pressure. Looking at the Zulu kingdom, the political dimension of polygamy is strikingly revealed. Shaka, who founded the Zulu state at the beginning of the 19th century, reorganized the institution of marriage. Alongside his military and political transformations, Shaka himself did not marry. However, as the empire expanded, political marriage networks became an integrative element of the state. In Zulu customary law, the lobala, bride price, system served as an indispensable regulatory mechanism for polygamous marriages. In the Ashanti Confederation, a matrilineal lineage system coexisted alongside a polygamous social order. In Ashanti society, a person's lineage group is determined by the mother's side. Inheritance flows to the mother's brother. This matrilineal structure is not in conflict with a man having more than one wife. On the contrary, each wife and her children are secure within their own lineage group. In many African countries today, polygamy remains legal. Yet reading this picture as a simple continuation would be misleading. The colonial era deeply shook Africa's marriage practices. European colonial powers at times legally restricted or socially stigmatized polygamy through the legal systems they applied in Africa. Christian missionaries presented monogamy as a moral necessity, and this message gradually became a strong norm among communities that converted to Christianity. Most African states that gained independence in the post-colonial period applied traditional law alongside colonial law, derived from British or French sources. In countries such as Ghana, Kenya, and Tanzania, both traditional and British common law-based marriage systems continue to coexist. This dual structure reflects practical realities, but also creates serious legal problems regarding conflicting rights and statuses. Today, the demographics of polygamy in Africa present a contested and variable picture. In the Sahel region and parts of West Africa, the proportion of polygamous households is estimated to exceed 30%. Meanwhile, urbanization, the expansion of education, and economic pressures are making polygamy a more costly and practically more difficult choice. The feminist and women's rights movement has formed an important front of criticism against polygamy in Africa. This criticism has been charged with both transmitting external Western norms and ignoring local dynamics. Some African feminist academics argue that the problem lies not with polygamy itself, but rather with the inequalities caused by power imbalances and economic dependency within these relationships. The history of polygamy in Africa constitutes one of the most vivid arenas where the tension between global norms and local traditions is experienced. This picture can be evaluated neither in an entirely positive nor an entirely negative light. It becomes comprehensible only when historical conditions, economic realities, and social dynamics are taken into account together. Chapter 7: The Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. The indigenous peoples of the American continent possess a cultural diversity unmatched anywhere in the world. Across the vast geography stretching from the Arctic zone of North America to the Amazon region of South America, hundreds of different languages, religions, and social orders have developed over thousands of years. Marriage practices, too, are a reflection of this great diversity. In many native communities of North America, the marital order was very different from what European settlers encountered upon their arrival. This difference was a cause for astonishment or condemnation among many Europeans. Yet these practices were sophisticated social institutions with their own internal logic and functions among certain peoples living on the Great Plains of North America. For instance, in certain sections of Lakota Sioux communities, a man's marriage to more than one woman was both possible and socially acceptable. The economic dimension of this practice was critical. Bison hunting was an extremely labor-intensive activity, and a large family provided decisive capacity for both the hunter and for activities such as hide working and drying. At the same time, in such polygamous arrangements, sororal polygyny, the practice of a man marrying sisters was widespread as a preference aimed at reducing tensions in the household. It was observed that related women coexisted more harmoniously in the same household. The Haida and Tlingit peoples living on the northwest coast north of the Great Lakes possessed a social structure based on two large lineage groups known as the moiety system. In this structure, marriage was a vital tool for balance and continuity between lineage groups. In some of these communities, chiefs or wealthy men could have more than one wife, viewed as an indication of both prestige and economic resources. In the American Southwest, a different picture emerges among the Pueblo peoples. Communities such as the Hopi and Zuni have strong matrilineal lineage systems and matrilineal settlement patterns, in which the married couple settles with the wife's family. This structure created a factor practically restricting polygyny for men, since taking responsibility for more than one separate household was extremely difficult, both economically and logistically. Looking at South America, the communities of Amazonia's tropical forests have been the subject of a rich ethnographic literature. Polygynous practices have been observed in some Yanomami communities. However, These practices must be understood in the context of warfare and blood-food sociodynamics in many Amazonian communities. Meanwhile, the belief in shared paternity presents a fascinating dimension. This belief rests on the idea that a child may have more than one biological father. That is, if a woman has sexual relations with more than one man during pregnancy, all of these men are considered the child's partial father and bear responsibility toward the child. This belief system is called partible paternity and clearly demonstrates how Western categories regarding marriage and sexuality prove inadequate when applied to other cultural realities. Looking at the Andean civilizations of South America, the Inca Empire, polygamy is seen to exist within an order integrated with political and social hierarchy. In Inca society, the Sapa Inca, the emperor had in principle an unlimited right to acquire wives. Additionally, groups of women known as acunas, trained in special temples and dedicated to the emperor or the sun god, constituted a unique part of this system. The nobility and regional administrators could also possess more than one wife to a proportional degree in accordance with their position in the hierarchy. When European colonizers set foot on the continent, the great majority of these marriage practices confronted systematic suppression. Spanish and Portuguese missionaries aimed to entirely eradicate polygamy and their forms of marriage incompatible with the Christian understanding. This process was not merely a cultural transformation. It was part of a process of domination encompassing the dispossession of the indigenous population, the dissolution of family structures, and the redefinition of their identities. Today, indigenous communities in North and South America, having largely lost traditional marriage practices, are in a process of remembering, researching, and reassessing these practices as part of their cultural identity. This assessment is neither an idealization nor a denial, but a conscious effort to confront a complex historical legacy. Chapter 8: Europe in the Age of Reform. Protestants, Catholics, and the debate on plural marriage. The beginning of the 16th century, Europe entered one of the most turbulent periods in its history from a religious, political, and social standpoint. The Protestant movement, initiated by Martin Luther's 95 Theses nailed to a door in Wittenberg in 1517, shook not only the understanding of religion, but the institution of marriage to its foundations. The medieval Catholic Church recognized marriage as one of 7 sacraments and built the norm of monogamy upon this definition. Marriage was a sacred covenant before God, and divorce was nearly impossible. Church courts held the authority to adjudicate matrimonial disputes, an authority signifying both temporal power and a considerable source of revenue. Protestantism converted marriage from a sacrament into a civil contract. This perspective offered a flexibility that could, in theory, soften rigid marriage norms. However, Protestant reformers differed in their attitudes toward polygamy. Martin Luther once composed controversial interpretation suggesting that polygamy conflicted not with God's laws, but only with church teaching. This view quick took on a practical dimension in Luther's Germany. Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, arguing that he could not divorce or abandon his first wife, as this would cause extremely socially damaging consequences. Yet unhappy in this marriage, sought approval from Protestant reformers to marry a new woman. Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer gave their approval for this second marriage in a confidential advisory letter. Philip subsequently disclosed this information publicly, causing a serious scandal. This event placed the reformers in an extremely difficult position and compelled them to clarify their positions on polygamy. The Münster Anabaptists constitute the most striking chapter of this debate. Between 1934 and 1935, the city of Münster came under the control of millenarian Anabaptist groups. Under the leadership of Jan van Leyden, this group aimed to re-establish God's kingdom on earth. Drawing on the Old Testament, they not only theoretically defended polygamy, but put it into practice. Jan van Leyden acquired 16 wives. In Münster, women of marriageable age were compelled to marry a man who already had a wife. This development was vehemently condemned by neighboring Protestant and Catholic powers. The city was ultimately taken by siege and massacre in 1535. The Münster experience left long-lasting effects for both Protestantism and European politics. It was presented as a concrete example of the danger that radical religious movements posed to social order, and largely closed the debate on polygamy within Protestant orthodoxy. The situation of England in this period deserves separate attention. Henry Zari's 6 marriages constitute one of the best-known matrimonial narratives in European history. Yet Henry's case was technically concerned not with polygamy, but with a series of marriages ended through annulments and deaths. Nonetheless, this picture makes clear just how political a function the institution of marriage served even at the royal level. During the Renaissance in Europe, especially in humanist circles, the renewed orientation toward ancient sources prepared the ground for a fresh questioning of the institution of marriage. Thomas More, in Utopia, proposed a system in which the parties could see each other unclothed before marriage. Erasmus authored sharp satires on marriage and sexuality. These debates largely criticized and sought to refound the existing understanding of marriage, rather than question monogamy per se. They were broadening the terrain of discussion. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Reformed Council convened between Womfie 45 and 155563, clarified and toughened Catholic teaching on marriage in response to the Protestant Reformation. The sacred character of marriage was reaffirmed. It was made compulsory that the marriage ceremony be conducted in a church, before a priest and in the presence of witnesses. Polygamy was characterized as an explicit crime and defined as an act punishable by excommunication. The matrimonial debates of the Age of Reform were not merely a religious polemic. They were simultaneously a political struggle. who would define marriage, who would resolve matrimonial disputes, who would determine rights to legitimate children and inheritance? The answers given to these questions laid the foundations of the modern European state, family, and law. Chapter 9: Colonialism and Marriage. The price of global transformation from the 15th century onward. As European powers spread to the four corners of the world, the institution of marriage also became a global battlefield. In this process, European colonizers presented their own understanding of marriage as a universal and superior norm, characterizing the different practices they encountered as primitiveness, moral corruption, or religious heresy. Colonialism was thus not merely a political and economic project. It was also a politics of identity that redefined marriage, family, and sexuality. The process, beginning with the Spanish arrival on the American continent in 1492, also brought with it a systematic transformation policy targeting the family structures of indigenous peoples. The encomienda system, mission institutions, and the Christianization programs accompanying them demanded that indigenous men abandon their polygamous practices or surplus wives. This demand was not merely a religious imposition. It was an intervention that fractured the economic and demographic structure of households. In South America, Spanish conquistadors experienced mixed marriages known as mezclados in large numbers. Spanish men formed informal unions with indigenous women. Colonist landowners, known as encomenderos, contracted marriages with local noble families, a process that became both a tool of social mobility and social control. The mestizo population, born of this process, emerged within colonial society with often ambiguous legal status and frequently contested cultural identity. A similar picture is observed in North America under British colonialism. Polygamous practices prevalent in many indigenous communities in the pre-European period were systematically targeted by Christian missionaries and colonial administrations. Puritan mission communities in 17th century New England explicitly demanded that indigenous men who had converted to Christianity abandon their additional wives. This demand was generally met with strong resistance and led, in many cases, to the disintegration of communities. In Africa, colonialism left a more complex and contradictory impact on polygamy. British colonial administration initially tended to avoid direct intervention in traditional African marriage institutions, as such intervention carried risks of political instability and complicated colonial governance. Christian missionaries, however, were far more direct and insistent in this area. Missionary societies active in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa demanded that Africans who converted to Christianity be monogamous. This demand caused a deep rupture in many communities. Within the same family, brothers who had become Christian embraced the monogamy norm, while those who maintained their traditional beliefs continued with polygamy. In India, British colonialism passed numerous laws in the 19th century that directly affected the institution of marriage. The Hindu Widows' Remarriage Act of 1856 legalized the remarriage of widows. While presented as a reform, it was simultaneously part of a reshaping of traditional Hindu law according to British values. On the matter of polygamy, the British preferred to influence Indian society indirectly through missionary activities and educational institutions rather than through direct intervention. Colonialism not only forcibly transformed traditional practices, it also created new hierarchies and identity categories. The discourse of civilization positioned European marriage norms as an indicator of progress and civilization. This discourse prepared the ground for colonized communities to view their own practices as shameful. However, when colonial history is examined carefully, it is seen that this transformation was neither fully successful nor unidirectional. Many communities maintain their own traditions in private life while appearing to comply with Christian norms at the formal level. Mixed practices emerged. A ceremony might be Christian, but the domestic arrangement could preserve the traditional structure. States that gained independence in the post-colonial era were forced to confront this complex legacy. Which marriage system would be adopted? Traditional law, colonial law, or a new synthesis integrating both? These questions continue to be debated, and legal frameworks continue to be shaped in many countries to this day. Chapter 10: The Mormons and Plural Marriage, America's Gres Religios. In the mid-19th century, the United States confronted one of the world's most unusual religious practices in recorded history. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Mormons openly advocated and practiced what they called plural marriage. This pictured not only the political and legal history of America, but the fundamental questions concerning religious freedom, state authority, and the boundaries of the concept of marriage. The church's founder, Joseph Smith, announced plural marriage as a requirement of sacred revelation in the early 1840s. Smith thought that this doctrine was rooted in the practice of the Old Testament prophets and had been newly commanded to believers through revelation. Initial reactions within the church were divided. For many believers, this teaching caused profound shock. However, over time, the practice became an inseparable part of the church. After Smith's death by mob in 1844, Brigham Young took over the church. Young openly declared plural marriage and led the westward expansion, including the migration to Utah. The Mormon colony in the Great Salt Lake Valley began providing the most visible examples of plural marriage practice from the early 1850s. Young himself is known to have married more than 33 wives, a circumstance valued as a symbol of both his religious authority and his social status. The federal government's response was slow but severe. The Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862 formally defined marriage to more than 2 spouses as a crime in Utah territory. Yet this law could not initially be effectively enforced, since the majority of Utah's police and courts were members of the Mormon faith. The Poland Act of 1874 and then the Edmunds Act of 1882 brought far more powerful enforcement tools. Under these laws, polygamous Mormons faced fines and imprisonment. Many church leaders were forced into hiding or exile. Church properties were confiscated. One of the most important legal cases of this period is the 1879 case of Reynolds v. United States. The Supreme Court, drawing a distinction between religious belief and practice, ruled that the government could regulate religious practices, but could not regulate religious beliefs alone. This decision set a fundamental precedent on the limits of religious freedom and substantially broke Mormon legal resistance. In 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued the declaration known as the Manifesto. This declaration called upon church members to refrain from contracting marriages contrary to the laws of the United States. Many Mormons and historians have interpreted this declaration differently, as a religious retreat or a pragmatic accommodation. Utah's admission to the Union as a state in 1896 was largely its rupture. However, this official acceptance did not entirely bring plural marriage to an end. Fundamentalist groups that split from the main Mormon church came to be known as fundamentalist Mormons and continue to exist today, with a population ranging between 20 and 50,000. Communities living in the Colorado City area, various rural parts of Utah, and the British Columbia province of Canada continue to practice plural marriage. Allegations of abduction, forced underage marriage, and sexual abuse that are periodically brought to public attention have made these communities politically controversial. The Warren Jeffs case has become a historical reference point in this context. Jeffs, one of the leading figures of fundamentalist Mormon communities, was placed on the FBI's Most Wanted list in 2006. He was tried on charges of forced marriages involving young girls and sexual abuse, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The history of Mormon plural marriage is intertwined with broader historical questions. To what degree can the state regulate individual belief? Is marriage a universal moral category or a cultural definition? These questions continue to reverberate in American law and politics. Chapter 11, Polyandry. The historically female-led form of plural marriage in debates about polygamy, polygyny, a man's multiple wives, has occupied nearly the entire center of attention, while polyandry has remained at the margins of historical narrative. Yet polyandry, a woman being married to more than one man simultaneously, is a practice that genuinely existed in human history and acquired an institutional dimension in some communities. It offers an extremely unique perspective on the relationship between gender, property, and marriage. Looking at documented examples of polyandry worldwide, Tibet and the Himalayan regions stand out. The practice known as fraternal polyandry in some communities of Tibet and Nepal's Himalayan regions appears in historical records and in the accounts of European travelers and missionaries from the 17th century onward. This practice involves a woman being simultaneously married to two or more brothers. The logic governing this arrangement is primarily economic. In the high mountain valleys of Tibet, agricultural land was extremely scarce and valuable. If each brother married a separate woman, the land divided through inheritance would be split into small, unviable plots. Fraternal polyandry ensured that this land remained intact as a single unit. One wife and several male husbands, living together in a shared household, kept both labor and resources integrated. Within this framework, polyandry was not merely a sexual or emotional arrangement, but a unique response to the property problems of a high-altitude agricultural economy. Researcher Melvin Goldstein conducted detailed field work in the 1970s, documenting Tibetan polyandry in Sikkim. Goldstein's work brought to light important findings and observations on how this system operated. While relationships among brothers often encompassed a harmony born of their shared upbringing, management of the household generally fell to the elder brother. Goldstein also reported that this system did not always operate without friction. Jealousy and tensions were addressed through negotiation between households. The Nair Khmer community of South India, particularly in Kerala, represents another unique example. In Nair tradition, an arrangement known as sambandham involved a form of relationship in which a woman accepted the visits of more than one man. In this arrangement, the woman was the center of the matriarchal unit. Children followed the mother's lineage. Men's control over property and inheritance remained within the mother's lineage. Debates continue as to whether this system can be fully classified as polyandry. But it certainly represents a relationship structure fundamentally divergent from Western monogamous norms. The Toda tribe of South India was another community documented by 19th century ethnographers in which fraternal polyandry was recorded. W.H.R. Rivers, conducting research among the Toda, reported this relationship structure in detail in his 1906 work. Another context in which polyandry appears in historical records is wartime. In communities where the male population had been severely reduced, multi-husband arrangements have emerged as responses to practical problems regarding resources and family structure. This demonstrates once more that plural marriage arrangements cannot be evaluated as an abstract moral issue independent of demographic conditions. The question of why polyandry is so rare is a contested topic in evolutionary biology and sociology. Some researchers argue that polygyny is more compatible with biological reproductive strategies, while others maintain that structural economic conditions are determinative. Polygyny has largely emerged under specific conditions where scarce resources, small plots of land, and strong fraternal bonds converge. As these conditions change, the practice has also transformed or disappeared. The history of polyandry reveals that the vast majority of analyses on polygamy carry a gendered perspective. When polygamy is mentioned, it is typically the male perspective that comes to mind. Polyandry invites questioning the identification of the institution of marriage with male dominance by stepping outside this paradigm. Chapter 12. The Modern World. Alarms, norms, and ongoing debates. The 20th century and beyond have profoundly redrawn the legal, demographic, and cultural map of polygamy. Globalization, the discourse of human rights, feminist movements, and the questioning of religious traditions from both within and without have reopened this practice for discussion in all its dimensions. Today, the legal status of polygamy differs greatly across different regions of the world. In many countries of sub-Saharan Africa, polygamy remains legal, though it is gradually declining in practice. In some Muslim-majority countries of Southeast Asia, polygamy is subject to court approval. In much of the Middle East, polygamy remains legal within the framework of Islamic law. In Western Europe, North America, South America, and much of East Asia, polygamy is legally prohibited. One significant transformation of the 20th century was China's marriage law of 1950. This law formally prohibited polygamy, which had existed in Chinese society for centuries. The new Republic of China carried with this regulation the dual claim of eliminating the feudal legacy and strengthening women's rights. In India, the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 prohibited polygamy for Hindus. However, the Muslim minority continued to apply Islamic law within the framework of personal status laws. This dual structure continues to be a politically contentious issue in India today. On the African continent, states that gained independence in the post-colonial period adopted different approaches to regulating marriage law. Ghana created a legal framework in 1985, combining traditional and common law marriages through the interstate succession law. Though explicit regulation of polygamy remained controversial, South Africa, through the Recognition Act of 1998, granted legal validity to traditional Zulu marriage practices, including polygamy. Today, polygamy advocacy and political debate takes different forms in many countries. Some human rights advocates argue that consensual polygamous relationships between adults should be decriminalized or given legal protection. This advocacy rests not only on religious grounds, but also on secular arguments regarding autonomy, consent, and the limits of state intervention in private life. The rise of polyamory. Maintaining romantic or sexual relationships with more than one person on a consensual basis is a comparatively recent phenomenon observed particularly in Western societies. Polyamorists distinguish themselves from historical polygamy, defining a relationship style based not on religious or cultural, but on open communication, consent, and conscious choice within an ethical framework. This movement is bringing back to the agenda the question of how marriage and family structure should be legally defined. Questions regarding children's rights in polygamous family structures also retain their currency. How the rights of children born in polygamous households, such as inheritance, legal citizenship, and access to protective standards, can be guaranteed remains an important topic of debate among legal scholars and policymakers. From a feminist perspective, the situation is multidimensional. One camp argues that polygamy, particularly polygyny, structurally positions women in a secondary role and is therefore incompatible with feminist principles. Other feminist academics, however, locate the essential problem in power imbalances and economic dependency. What is problematic is not polygamy itself, but the unequal power relations between spouses. According to this view, once consent and equality are ensured, polygamy does not conflict with feminist principles. Looking from a historical perspective, it is apparent that debate over polygamy has never been merely about marriage. It is simultaneously a debate about gender, power, economics, religion, and the authority of the state over individual lives. Over the centuries, these questions have been reshaped rather than answered, and this demonstrates that humanity's debate on the subject of marriage is bound to continue inevitably. Chapter 13. The Social Sciences and Plural Marriage. What do we know? Humanity has both defended and condemned polygamy over the centuries, both given it legal protection and defined it as a crime. What do the social sciences say about this practice today? Anthropology, sociology, economics, and psychology have developed various models to explain the causes, consequences, and cultural distribution of polygamy. Looking at the anthropological literature, George Peter Murdoch's 1957 cross-cultural database presents striking findings. In this database of approximately 850 cultures, 56% are seen to define polygyny as a legitimate and preferred form of marriage. 40% consist of cultures preferring or accepting monogamy as the dominant norm. 2% document polyandry. This distribution clearly demonstrates that monogamy is not a universal norm embraced by the great majority of humanity. On the contrary, it is the product of specific cultural, historical, and economic conditions. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology offer different perspectives on the evolutionary origins of the human mating system. Some researchers argue that humans possess a mixed reproductive strategy incorporating both monogamy and a propensity toward limited polygyny. This interpretation claims to explain both the tendency toward long-term care and bonding between partners and the tendency toward multiple reproduction observed in high status across various cultures. Economic approaches analyze polygamy through variables such as resource distribution, labor organization, and property transfer. Various empirical studies have shown that polygamy is in practice a largely restricted phenomenon. That is, only men with resources can have more than one wife. This finding is supportive of the argument that the number of wives serves as an indicator of a man's economic power. Sociologists have focused on hierarchy among wives and negotiation dynamics within the household. Many studies show that resource competition and status differences in polygamous households create strong sources of tension and conflict. These findings provide an important basis for understanding the structural tensions inherent in polygamous arrangements, independent of religious or traditional legitimacy. Psychological research focuses on women and children living in polygamous households. Some studies conducted in polygamous households in West Africa and the Middle East have reported that women experience higher levels of psychological stress and depression. Other research, however, has also revealed that in some contexts women evaluate polygamy positively because it offers practical benefits such as resource sharing, maternal support, and labor convenience. These conflicting findings suggest that the experience varies greatly depending on context, economic conditions, legal framework, and the conditions under which women enter this arrangement. Research on children also presents a complex picture. Factors such as resource competition and maternal stress can negatively affect children's health and educational outcomes. On the other hand, having a larger support network in polygamous households, with more caregivers available, can sometimes offer children more adult care and supervision. Demographic studies show that polygamy is in decline globally. Urbanization, rising female education levels, economic development, and legal reforms are reducing polygamy even in regions where it has been traditionally more prevalent. This trend is neither a modest nor a straightforward change. It reflects a complex process at which societal transformation, individual preference, and structural constraints intersect. Nevertheless, the capacity of the social sciences to provide definitive answers in this area is limited. Value judgments regarding marriage norms must be kept separate from empirical findings. Findings showing that polygamy produces negative outcomes for some individuals under certain conditions do not mean that this practice is as universally and in all contexts harmful. While the social sciences do not offer a definitive moral resolution to this debate, they provide tools that can contribute to more informed and evidence-based decision-making. Chapter 14, Plural Marriage in Southeast Asia. Buddhism, Hinduism, and tradition in the southern and southeastern regions of the Asian continent. Marriage practices have taken shape at the intersection of very different religious systems, social orders, and historical processes. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and older animist traditions have influenced the marriage understanding of this region on different layers. Looking at ancient Indian texts, particularly the Manusmriti, known as the Laws of Manu, polygamy is defined as a legitimate practice tied to caste and social status. It is stated that high caste Brahmin men could have more than one wife, though these unions were subject to certain restrictions. Men from the Kshatriya warrior caste could also possess more than one wife. For lower caste communities, the situation was different. Economic power continued to be the fundamental determining factor. The great Indian epics, such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, contain examples of both polygamy and polyandry. Rama, despite being the ideal male figure of the epic, is associated with monogamy. His fidelity to Sita is presented as an almost sacred model of devotion. On the other side, the marriage of the 5 Pandava brothers to Draupadi constitutes one of the most striking examples of polyandry legitimized at the epic level. Buddhism differs fundamentally in its approach to marriage. Buddhist teaching does not mandate or prohibit a specific marriage structure in accordance with religious belief. In practice, communities into which Buddhism spread continue to maintain their own traditional marriage norms. In Sri Lanka and Burma, Buddhist communities largely adopted the tradition of monogamy. In Tibet and some Himalayan communities, Buddhism coexisted with the polyandrous practices described earlier. Moving to Southeast Asia, the Malay world and the Indonesian archipelago present an interesting picture. Islam spread to this region from the 10th and 14th centuries onward through trade networks. In the process of Islamization, polygamy was placed on a legal footing within the framework offered by the Quran. In Indonesia and Malaysia, polygamy is today legal while being subject to court approval and the first wife's consent. Application of these conditions varies from region to region. The Philippines presents an example that stands outside this picture. Spanish colonialism and centuries of Catholic missionary activity made the Philippines one of the countries in Asia with the strongest monogamy norm. Today, the Philippines is the only country besides the Vatican where divorce is not formally legally recognized. This situation clearly demonstrates how enduring the institutional effects of colonialism on marriage can be. In Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, the historical process is more nuanced. Polygamy existed in court tradition in these countries, while among urban and rural populations, monogamous practice remained largely dominant. The modern family laws enacted in the post-colonial period in these countries also adopted monogamy as the legal norm. Looking at this diverse picture across South and Southeast Asia, is evident that it is impossible to explain marriage practices through a single religious or cultural determinant. Religion, economics, colonialism, lineage systems, and demographic conjunctions have created a unique combination in each society of the region. And this combination has continued to transform over time. This diversity provides one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that marriage norms cannot be evaluated independently of their cultural context. Chapter 15, Closing Words. The universal questions of human marriage throughout history. Humanity's approach to the practice of polygamy is in one sense a mirror of how it has produced responses to the common questions of human life, love, power, justice, in the continuity of life. The practices we have explored throughout this narrative are not merely fossils of the past. They are questions whose echoes still resound today. Polygamy was never a single thing. From the legal contracts carved in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the economic necessities of Tibet's high-altitude valleys, from the political alliance marriages of the Mongol steppes to the broad social networks of indigenous America, from the debates of Jewish religious law to the justice, condition of Islam, and the Mormon struggle in America, this panorama encompasses practices of very different meanings and functions. The first great lesson this history teaches us is this: the institution of marriage never possessed a pure and universal form. Marriage is a dynamic institution that differs according to its era, geography, economy, and beliefs, one that is constantly reshaped in the effort to respond to society's most fundamental needs. Seeing this reality is not a tool for either idealizing the past or judging the present. It is a gateway to understanding the infinite diversity and intelligence of humanity. The second great lesson is this: power and gender never left the institution of marriage. In the great majority of historical examples of polygamy, the economic and political power of men was the determining element. Polygamy most often functioned as a tool reinforcing inequality. Sometimes this function manifested openly, sometimes covertly. Yet the same history also contains stories of women who succeeded in transcending these constraints. From Hurrem's sultans' transformative influence at court to the position of women in polyandrous practice, these stories remind us that power relations are not unidirectional, that there has always been a space for resistance, accommodation, and reshaping. The third and final great lesson is this: we who narrate this history are within this same history. Whatever marriage norm we embrace today, we carry the traces of these practices and debates that existed in the past. Modern law, contemporary moral understanding, religion, and culture have been distilled through this long and complex historical process to reach the present day. This historical journey through polygamy is ultimately an occasion for asking a universal question. How do human communities organize love and bond? None of the answers given to this are definitive or final, but understanding these answers forms an indispensable foundation for comprehending both the past and the future with a clearer mind. History never offers us ready-made answers, but it offers the depth needed to ask the right questions. And the most powerful truth this history reveals is this: humanity has been compelled in every age to rediscover anew what love and bond are, how they are shared, and how they are sustained. This effort of discovery, too, is one of humanity's most enduring legacies.